They found Nolan Wells' phone. They found his car keys. They even found the boat that had taken him to Horn Island. But Nolan was gone 48 hours later. Search teams discovered the 18-year-old floating in the waters off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. Authorities initially believed he had drowned. His family believes too many questions remain unanswered. Tonight, using verified reporting, official records, and statements from investigators in Nolan's family, we're reconstructing his final known hours. Because somewhere between arriving on Horn Island and the last boat leaving, something happened. You're watching Dark Case Files. If you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries built on verified evidence, not speculation, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Let's begin. Before investigators searched the water, before national headlines carried his name, Nolan Xavier Wells was looking toward the future. He had recently graduated from Ocean Springs High School. Friends remembered him as someone who stayed out of trouble, a talented athlete, a teammate, someone who made people laugh. He was preparing to continue his football career in college. His family says he was excited about what came next. No one imagined that Independence Day weekend would become the last chapter of his life. The day before the trip, Nolan hugged his mother. He told her he loved her. It wasn't unusual. It was simply a son saying goodbye before spending the holiday with friends. His mother, Christine Wansley, watched him leave. She expected him home later that night. Instead, that ordinary goodbye became her final memory of her son. On the morning of the 4th of July, 2026, Nolan joined friends heading toward Horn Island. Located several miles off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, Horn Island is part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. There are no homes, no businesses, no permanent emergency services. If you arrive by boat, you leave by boat. That morning, dozens of boats crossed the water carrying hundreds of people celebrating Independence Day. Music filled the shoreline. Groups gathered around coolers. People swam. Others played games on the beach. Photos and videos from that afternoon show a normal holiday celebration. Nothing in those images hinted at the tragedy that would follow. As afternoon turned into evening, the celebration slowly came to an end. Boat owners began calling friends together. People packed their belongings. The boats prepared to leave. According to statements later provided to investigators, some of Nolan's friends said he decided to remain on the island after meeting a young woman. They said he handed over his phone because he didn't want it getting wet. Investigators have acknowledged those accounts, but many details remain under investigation. That moment would become one of the most closely examined parts of the case, because after that, no confirmed public account fully explains Nolan's movements. Then investigators noticed something else. No photographs, no videos. No witness statement has publicly filled the gap between Nolan's last confirmed sighting and his disappearance. That missing stretch of time remains one of the biggest unanswered questions. Back on the mainland, Christine Wansley expected to hear her son's voice. Hours passed. No call, no message, no knock at the door. As fireworks lit up the Mississippi sky, her concern turned into fear. Around 11 p.m., one of Nolan's friends contacted her. Nolan hadn't returned from Horn Island. Almost immediately, his parents began calling anyone who might know where he was. Law enforcement was notified. Search teams started organizing. Everyone hoped there was a simple explanation. Maybe he had boarded another boat. Maybe he had become stranded on the island. Maybe his phone had simply died. But as investigators began speaking with witnesses, the timeline became harder to understand. Then came a discovery that changed everything. Nolan's phone had already returned to the mainland. His parents later recovered it. According to the family, they also noticed deleted messages on the device. Authorities have not publicly explained those concerns, and they remain part of the family's unanswered questions. If Nolan's phone wasn't with him, where was Nolan? The next morning, the search expanded across Horn Island. Boats searched the shoreline. Helicopters scanned the Gulf. Volunteers walked miles of beach. Then investigators made another discovery. Nolan's car keys were also back on the mainland. His phone, his keys, Both had made it home, but Nolan hadn't. And over the next 48 hours, the search would uncover a discovery that transformed a missing person case into a national investigation. By sunrise on July 5, hope was still alive. Investigators believed Nolan could still be somewhere on Horn Island. Maybe he'd become separated from his friends. Maybe he'd spent the night on another boat. Maybe he was waiting for rescue. Every possibility remained on the table. Then, the search began. Marine patrol boats moved slowly along the shoreline. Helicopters circled overhead. Deputies searched beaches, marshes, and dense vegetation. Volunteers joined the effort, hoping they would be the ones to bring Nolan home alive. Horn Island stretches for miles. Its beaches are separated by thick brush, tidal pools, and changing sandbars. Searching every corner would take time. Time Nolan's family feared they didn't have. As investigators interviewed the people who had been on the island, the questions multiplied. Who had seen Nolan last? What time was it? Exactly where had he been standing? Who was the young woman witnesses said he had spoken with? Could every account be independently confirmed? Some witnesses remembered one thing. Others remembered something different. Investigators continued comparing photographs, phone records, and witness statements, trying to rebuild Nolan's final hours. But one stretch of time remained missing. No publicly released evidence has fully explained what happened after Nolan was last seen by those who had arrived with him. That gap would become the center of the investigation. Then another detail surfaced. It wasn't just Nolan's phone that had been left behind. Something else had also made it back to the mainland. Nolan's car keys were recovered on the mainland. According to Nolan's father, he later retrieved the keys from the home connected to members of the group Nolan had been with before the trip. For his parents, that discovery deepened the mystery. His phone, his keys, both safely back on land. Yet Nolan himself had vanished. His family struggled to understand how someone could disappear without leaving behind a clear explanation. News of Nolan's disappearance spread quickly across Mississippi. Friends reposted his photo across social media. Volunteers offered boats. Others searched nearby marinas and docks. People who had never met Nolan joined the effort. Everyone hoped the next phone call would bring good news. As the hours passed, the search expanded into the surrounding Gulf waters. Investigators also asked anyone who had been on Horn Island that day to submit original photos and videos. Sometimes, a single image captures something no one notices in the moment. Authorities hoped those images could reveal where Nolan had been, or who had been near him. Then, on the morning of July 6, the search came to an end. Search teams located Nolan Wells' body in the waters near Horn Island. For his parents, the hope they had held on to for 2 days disappeared in a single phone call. The Jackson County coroner later confirmed Nolan's identity. What had begun as a desperate search was now a death investigation. Investigators initially said they believed Nolan had accidentally drowned. At the same time, officials emphasized that the investigation was still active. Evidence was still being collected. Witnesses were still being interviewed. The official autopsy and toxicology reports had not yet been completed. For Nolan's family, those early statements raised difficult questions. How could anyone know exactly what happened before every piece of evidence had been examined? That question would stay with them throughout the investigation. Then, the family's own investigation took an unexpected turn. They decided they couldn't rely on one examination alone. They wanted another opinion. And that decision would bring the case back into national headlines. Only days after Nolan was found, his family retained nationally known civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Standing beside Nolan's parents, Crump called for a complete and transparent investigation. He wasn't asking investigators to reach a particular conclusion. He was asking them to follow every piece of evidence, interview every witness, and answer every unanswered question before closing the case. For Nolan's parents, this wasn't about headlines. It was about their son. They believed every parent deserves to know exactly what happened to their child. As more people learned about the case, public attention intensified. Online discussions focused on the missing hours, The phone, the keys, the witness timeline. Investigators continued gathering evidence, but many details remained confidential while the investigation continued. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. The story wasn't ending with the discovery of Nolan's body. It was only entering a new chapter. The independent autopsy was completed. Many expected it to settle the debate. Instead, it did the opposite. The report could not determine exactly how Nolan Wells died. And with those findings, the biggest mystery in the case remained exactly where it had begun. What really happened during Nolan Wells' final hours on Horn Island? For Nolan Wells' family, the discovery of his body wasn't the end of their search. It was the beginning of a different one. They needed answers, not assumptions, not theories, answers. Weeks after Nolan's death, an independent forensic pathologist, retained by the family, completed a second examination. Many believed the report would finally explain what had happened. Instead, it raised even more questions. The independent pathologist concluded that both the cause of death and the manner of death were undetermined, meaning the available evidence did not allow a definitive conclusion about how Nolan died. That finding did not confirm homicide. It also did not confirm an accidental drowning. It simply meant the available evidence could not answer the question everyone was asking. What happened to Nolan Wells? The report documented no skull fractures, no major broken bones, no severe internal injuries that clearly explained Nolan's death. It did note an area of red discoloration on the back of his head, but the pathologist stated that finding, by itself, could not establish how the injury occurred or whether it was related to Nolan's death. The report also explained that decomposition, together with procedures performed during the original state autopsy, limited what could be determined during the second examination. In other words, even after 2 examinations, some answers were no longer available. Then another development pushed the investigation back into the national spotlight, not because investigators had solved the case, but because they hadn't. For Christine Wansley, every unanswered question became another reason to keep searching. She has repeatedly said she wants investigators to account for every moment of Nolan's final day. Who was the last person to see him? What happened after he became separated from his friends? How did he end up in the water? And can every witness account be independently verified? Those questions remain central to the family's request for transparency. For them, this has never been about rushing to a conclusion. It's about making sure no question is left unanswered. As public attention continued to grow, Mississippi officials announced another important step. The evidence gathered during the investigation would be presented to a grand jury. That announcement generated headlines across the country. But it's important to understand what a grand jury does. A grand jury does not determine guilt or innocence. Its responsibility is to review evidence presented by prosecutors and decide whether there is sufficient legal basis for criminal charges. As of the time of this documentary, no one has been charged in connection with Nolan Wells' death. Authorities have also not publicly identified any suspect or accused anyone of wrongdoing. The investigation remains active. Meanwhile, the questions that first captured national attention still remain. Investigators continue reviewing witness statements, digital evidence, forensic reports, and every available piece of information. But several questions remain unresolved. Why did Nolan stay behind? Who was with him during his final known hours? What happened after the last confirmed sighting? How did his phone and keys make it safely back to the mainland? While Nolan never did, investigators have not publicly provided final answers to those questions. Until they do, the missing hours remain exactly that, missing. Across Mississippi, Nolan's name has not been forgotten. Friends have gathered for vigils. Former teammates have shared memories of his kindness, determination, and love of football. Community members have continued calling for a thorough investigation based on evidence. For many, this case is about more than one unanswered death. It's about making sure every family receives a complete and transparent investigation when a loved one doesn't come home. Sometimes, a true crime story ends with an arrest. Sometimes, It ends inside a courtroom. As of this recording, the official investigation into Nolan Wells's death is still ongoing. Authorities continue reviewing evidence. The grand jury process has not resulted in any publicly announced criminal charges. Until those findings are complete, the final chapter of Nolan's story has not yet been written. If there are significant verified developments in this investigation, we'll bring them to you here on Dark Case Files. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future investigations. If you believe factual, evidence-based reporting matters, share this video with others who follow true crime documentaries. And we'd like to hear from you. Which unanswered question do you believe investigators still need to answer before this case can be fully understood? Please keep the discussion respectful. Avoid speculation. Avoid accusing anyone who has not been charged. Let's focus on the verified facts and remember that behind every investigation, there is a family still searching for answers. Thank you for watching Dark Case Files.